Welcome back to our fourth session of Architecture for Geographers. We have two overlapping themes for this week. The first is the geographic location. Well, most of the things we're going to be looking at today are centered on one street, 42nd Street in Manhattan, and the Grand Central District as well. And then the second are skyscrapers, and we'll be looking at some really beautiful favorite buildings of mine. Actually around the country, but concentrating on that street. Our first section, as always, will be the Firmness section, and we'll be looking at metals this week. Copper and its alloys, then ferrous metals, steel and iron, and then other non-ferrous metals, particularly aluminum, and then some of the other corrosion issues that we see and coatings that we deal with them with. Then we'll move into a section on commodity and look at fire safety in particular and how architects and codes have reacted to tragedies in the same way that we've looked at them with structural issues. Then we'll take a 42nd Street inspired intermission and move on to a really fabulous architect's work, Raymond, who did some of the most beautiful skyscrapers around. In our delight section, we'll take a look at two other revivals, the Romanesque and the Gothic revivals, and study one particular aspect that I prefer about architecture, which is the idea of having one good idea per building. Differently than we've done in other weeks, I'm going to also show you two examples this week of projects that I'm not crazy about. I like other work of these architects, but these two projects ring some bad bells with me, and I'll explain why. And then we'll take a look at this week's assignment on color in architecture, focusing on one of the most colorful architects, Mexican architect Luis Barragan. And then we'll review the drama pieces from last week together, the in-house crit, and close up with a case study on Grand Central, particularly looking at its geographic implications. Now on to our Guess the Sketch game. This is a building in Connecticut. Can we guess what town or city it's in? Bronze is one of my favorite building materials, and as such I thought we'd use it as an introduction to our new considerations of building materials beyond their structural strength. In our first 3 weeks, we kind of studied firmness primarily from that aspect, but now we're freed up to begin considering building materials that are used primarily or for other attributes, particularly some more of their aesthetic qualities and how they make us feel. Well, we did see that concrete is one of the more versatile building materials and can be highly sculptural and decorative. It's not what I would characterize as being highly tactile or warm and cozy. Bronze, on the other hand, may not be cozy either, but it is warm. It's also very strong, and while not economic for general structural use, it's very useful for elements that we want to last for generations. Somehow its longevity seems to inspire artisans and designers to work more elegantly. I generally award 2 extra points to any bronze work and give it the benefit of the doubt no matter what it is. It just always seems to rise above. Ghiberti's baptistry doors are world-renowned examples of bronze sculptural utility, and being 600 years old, they demonstrate the timelessness of the material and why we love it. Of course, they don't match the 2,000-year-old doors we saw at the Pantheon in the first week, but they are decidedly beautiful. I personally prefer the north pair of doors, the ones on the left, but the ones on the right, Michelangelo himself nicknamed the Gates to Paradise, so I can see their charm as well. Copper and her alloys are some of the oldest original metals that humans have used in construction, and they continue to be some of the most useful and beautiful materials in our construction palette. We may be, as they say, carbon-based life forms that inhabit a silicon digital age, but without copper and her alloys' connectivity, life would be a lot less civilized. Copper wiring forms the basis of our electrical power grid, and every tool, electrical appliance, and instrument has some copper wiring in it. While other alternatives exist also for traditional brass piping, it still provides the backbone for our indoor plumbing lifestyles. Relatively pure copper is also extensively used in sheet form for roofing, stormwater guttering, flashings that protect openings and joints in building structures, and as siding itself. It is highly malleable and can be worked into profiles and forms to enhance its structural rigidity and for decorative effect. As you can see, sculptor Bartoli's Lady Liberty folds, bends, and curves perfectly to form his sculpture. And at this point, let's also remember to take a nod to Richard Morris Hunt, who we saw in our first session, who designed the base for the statue out of Connecticut granite. Brasses and bronzes are somewhat fluid in their definitions, but essentially brass is typically a zinc-copper alloy that can be blended in different proportions and sometimes with additional metals to achieve a variety of strengths, ductilities, and corrosion resistance. We often use it for building hardware, fasteners, railings, and as noted above, piping. Its malleability and elasticity are the reason brasses are used for wind instruments. Bronzes also vary in their alloy compositions, but architectural bronzes are typically copper tin alloys, and they outlast us human users by multiple generations. You're betting on the future when you build with bronze, as we saw with the Pantheon and Florence Baptistry doors. Notably, bronzes are especially appropriate for marine environments, as Zeus on the right here can attest. He spent over 2 millennia submerged in the salt water of the Adriatic before his shipwreck was discovered in 1926 off the coast of Greece. As a segue into our next material, let's recognize the third giant that worked on Lady Liberty. Gustav Eiffel designed the iron structural frame that supports the sculpture. The section on the right-hand side is an interesting diagram, and it clearly shows how he triangulated the frame to resist the racking lateral wind forces. It also shows that the frame is tied down with iron chains in tension to beams set low on the granite base. Without that, otherwise, Lady Liberty would go sailing off into the bay. And while, of course, he's most famous for the tower in Paris with his name, he is equally famous in architect and engineering circles for his bridges, and you know we love bridges. The Garabit Viaduct in the Central Massif in southeastern France is probably his most beautiful and most famous. Elegant and gorgeous. The red is like really striking and cool too. Iron and its steel alloys are the first choice in metals for building materials. The fallback will be steel as the most economical solution to any problem, unless special factors outweigh its general utility, corrosion being the primary issue that leads to other choices. But as we saw last week, even then frequently steel will still be the preference, and will mitigate the situation with protective coatings before changing materials. This handsome brownstone Romanesque building at Cooper Union, even though it doesn't look it, is in a way the granddaddy of modern American steel construction. It was intended to be the first structure built with an iron floor framing system. Peter Cooper had made his fortune in manufacturing the iron rails for railroads, and saw that with some modifications he thought they could be useful for framing buildings as well. He engineered the members and the system to roll them into 20-foot lengths, and patented them as I-beams, though they're more of an upside-down T with a bulb top, showing their lineage from the railroad rails. He intended to first use them here on his own project, but ended up selling them twice before they were ready for them here. Along with Frederick Peterson, his architect, they developed the floor system that we see in the diagrammatic detail on the left, where the iron beams span 20 feet between bearing walls, and shallow brick arches bearing on the bottom flanges support a concrete topping as the floor. Variations of this system remained popular for 80 years, till the arches were generally replaced by more steel itself as corrugated steel decking to support the concrete. Signage designed to be illegible? No. Well, now after about a 10-minute hike, we've come to the Hogwart building, a first in iron construction. This is the first cast iron building facade that is self-supporting. So whereas the Cooper Union building is a brownstone building that masks an iron frame, this is an iron building that looks like it's made out of stone. This is a gorgeous building, one of the highlights of the cast iron district of Soho. Another interesting tie-in between the two buildings is whereas the Cooper Union building was the first to have an elevator shaft, this is the first building with a modern passenger elevator. While even the Romans had elevators, freight elevators, for their 7-story tenement buildings in Rome, and dumbwaiters and other freight lifting devices have been used since antiquity continuously. This is the first one to use our own Connecticut Mr. Otis's safety brake that allows for a modern passenger elevator. No, again, no. New York City foundries, particularly in my native borough of the Bronx, produced the cast iron that became the fashion and spread across the entire United States. The balconies in the French Quarter in New Orleans, the cast iron storefronts in San Francisco, all were produced in the Bronx. The biggest and maybe most famous piece is the actual Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. The section on the right shows the iron frame supporting the cast iron dome itself. No, for the third and last time now, I was unprepared for this building by Thomas Maine for Morphosis when I first encountered it walking along 7th Street. Since then, I've never been in the building. I've seen photographs and the plans of the inside. It's a nice building inside and how it works, but it is pretty horrendous in terms of its impact on the street. This might have worked okay in a campus setting where it's set off, but it just crowds the sidewalk, overhangs it like it's a construction shed, and is not a pleasant experience to walk past. Its perforated steel skin sets it into this section of our conversations today, but I think I will discuss it as an aspect of delight more. Buildings don't always have to mimic their context, but they should be contextual. And this one is just crying out, making too big a deal of itself without setting itself in where it's coming from. It really is just trying too hard for me. It is intentionally less than transparent. Its opaqueness is an attribute, according to Mr. Maine, but to me, it just comes off as anti-urbanist. It's not inviting, and it's pushing the people of the East Village away. Its proponents in the Harvard School of Design review said that this is a wonderful example of a post-humanist design. I'm speechless. I don't know what species they're thinking about designing for if it's not humans. But this is all just me, and maybe my time has caught up with me. I don't know. Here's another more recent example of Morphosis's work that has a lot more room to spread out and be as sculptural as it wants. And honestly, it looks beautiful to me. It's gorgeous. I haven't really studied the plans, and I'll never get to go there. But it seems fabulous. And I think it really is the case of that the setting here has the room to spread out, and they can interject a lot of ideas as opposed to crowding it into that tiny site in the East Village. As we've seen, iron can be rolled into structural sections. It can be cast into decorative and functional pieces, and it can be wrought, as in blacksmithing, to produce useful and gorgeous pieces. A master of wrought iron was the factory of Samuel Yellen, which is still in operation today with his granddaughter working it. They produced beautiful gates, window grills, etc. There's a lot that you can see at Yale in the art gallery, particularly they're used there. New York City banks are full of them as protective grills and doors. If copper and her alloys can be considered the nerves and veins of modern life, steel, or the alloy of iron and carbon, is the skeleton of modern civilization then. As you can see in this image of a semicircular school my office built, rolled forms of H columns and channels, angles, and I or S structural beams are used to frame the bases of structures typically, while open web steel joists, as shown here spanning the roof, are often used to span floors and roofs economically, as well as providing convenient space to run piping, wiring, ductwork, and services. Specialty steel alloys can also be formulated to achieve all sorts of properties that are useful in architecture. The two biggest groupings of these are the stainless steels and then weathering steels. Stainless steels have typically some chromium added to them, while weathering steels have some copper added to them. Of each of those, there are numerous formulations that can achieve all sorts of different types of effects. While stainless steel is the more commonly used and has a lot of applications, the weathering steels, or Corten is the brand name, often it's called Corten steel, is used more extensively on structures. Whole buildings are sometimes built out of Corten steel. Separated by 35 years, but only one block, Chrysler Building's famous crown of stainless steel and the Ford Foundation's atrium and full structure of Corten steel are both beautiful examples right on 42nd Street in New York. The principal property of stainless steel, of course, is that it resists corrosion, while weathering steel corrodes so quickly it essentially blocks out any further corrosion from happening by forming such a tight web of the rust on the skin. Next, we'll move on to the other non-ferrous metals, of which the most commonly used architecturally is aluminum. Interesting, while as shown in this chart from an article last year by the World Economic Forum, it is the third most common element in the Earth's crust, surpassing even iron by nearly 50%, and it's used so ubiquitously now that there's a whole genre of aluminum siding salesman jokes. But it was only successfully refined into a metal in 1824 and was initially so expensive to produce and consequently so rare that it was a precious metal. At the time of the construction of the Washington Monument that we're looking at on the right, it was more valuable than gold. When they cast this pyramidal ingot of aluminum to cap the monument in the 1850s, it was the largest piece of aluminum in the world. Isn't that kind of cool? We used aluminum in rolled structural forms, castings, extrusions, sheets, and in multiple locations on the exterior of the buildings, particularly, and interiors as well. We used it for lightweight structures, as my canopy design that I did for Jam Wright High School on the right, and it is the most common framing material for windows and a lot of commercial doors. And for example, like that brise soleil, the shading device hanging over the windows on the window to the left there. Painted aluminum roofing is a very common, economical, and very functional and useful use of aluminum. Guttering and leader systems in aluminum are used with all sorts of roofing. Lead is an historically useful metal that we've used in buildings since antiquity. It's labeled Pb on the periodic table in acknowledgement of the Latin plumbum, which gives a hint as to its original traditional use in plumbing. Certain drainage piping bends were still fabricated from lead still in the mid-20th century. And lead is still used in cases where its ductility allows it to mold it to three-dimensional shapes as flashings or waterproofing stops. The image on the left is of lead step flashing at a gable and wall intersection. Earlier in my career, we still used lead-coated copper as a semi-premium roofing material, though that's since been supplanted by turn-coated stainless steel. Zinc-coated stainless steel is the image on the right. Confusingly, they're both called turn coatings because turn refers to its dull color and not to its composition. Zinc and tin are also often used as alloys with steels and brasses or bronzes, and sometimes as coatings for roofing or siding sheets. Finally, we have the more exotic, expensive, and precious metals. This example is a titanium-clad Bilbao museum that Frank Gehry did for the Guggenheims. Titanium is a fabulous material in terms of its weathering ability and its ability to take shapes. It's a pretty cool-looking building. Of course, traditionally we go for gold and silver leafing on buildings as well. Similarly to the weathering steels, copper, bronzes, the so-called turn metals, and aluminum all develop a tight, dense oxide surface layer that prevents further corrosion in most cases. Aluminum oxide isn't considered particularly attractive, but the others all develop patinas that are highly valued. Copper verdigris adds a bright splash, and you do have to be careful, though, that it can streak and run off onto other materials, as in this picture on the left. That can be done decoratively, I suppose, but more often you try and plan for it with guttering to run it off before it drips onto other pieces. The dull turn metals kind of evoke a classic gray flannel suit to me. They're businesslike and understated, quite beautiful. And the bronze patinas slowly, and so can be stopped anywhere along the line from, the deepest blacks to, more coppery tones. Another type of corrosion that occurs is so-called bimetallic corrosion or galvanic action corrosion, where two metals that are far apart on the galvanic scale will set up essentially an electric current between them and corroding the materials. This is never good, and so we try to plan for this by choosing metals that are compatible, closer to each other on the scale, or by isolating them with the coatings, plastics, silicone, neoprenes, or other barriers to prevent their touching each other. The decorative finishes on plain steels and aluminum are achieved through coatings. Either can just be plain painted or with more high-performance paints. Aluminum can also be anodized, which is an electric process that hardens the surface corrosion layer in the same way that it naturally does, but does it in a more controlled way, and can be dyed to various colors to simulate bronzes or have fluorescent colors even. Steel can be just plain painted. It can be electrostatically painted, so can the aluminum. They can both be electrostatically painted where they're charged and the paint sticks onto them. This is useful to repaint existing materials like window frames without having to really mask off the glass too much. And finally, steel can also be powder coated, which is a very high performance electrostatically charged paint that is then thermally set with relatively high heat. Our commodity section today will look at the basic commodity of not dying in a fire. One of the principal really health, safety, and welfare concern of an architect is fire safety. We address fire safety from several approaches concurrently. They overlap. The first is controlling the source of fire. Different building uses or occupancies, as we say, present different potential fire loads and hazards, and so require different levels of protection. As an example, a candy manufacturing factory with explosive sugar dust in the air has many more constraints on it than a corner candy store selling the same finished products. Or, as we saw in my Joyner Health Sciences building a couple of weeks ago, an operating room with flammable anesthetics has more fire potential than a classroom, even in the same building. The second is accounting for the fire load of the building elements themselves. The combustibility of structures, and most particularly interior finishes, are restricted and controlled in different occupancy types. For example, you won't see a brocaded fabric wallpaper in a school corridor. Instead, it's much more common to see a ceramic or stone tile wainscot with painted plaster or plasterboard above. The third is that we design structures to provide fire separations between spaces to restrain fire from rapidly spreading throughout a structure and particularly to protect exits, or as we say, means of egress. Remember, particularly from last week, that we're concerned with preventing the chimney effect from spreading fires vertically through a structure. How we control this is that the designs of all common building assemblies have been tested by independent code-approved agencies. Most commonly, the underwriters' laboratories or some public universities provide this as a service. And they determine a given assembly's ability to resist the spread of fire rated in units of hours of safety. Walls, floors, and roof is typically rated at 1, 2, or 3 hours of safety, so a 1-hour wall assembly. And doors typically have a 30-minute or 3/4 hour or a 90-minute rating. So example, a UL-rated wall assembly might have a 1-hour rating with a door and frame rated 3/4 of an hour that's intended to give the occupants an hour's worth of time to escape before fire escapes from the room of origin. The fourth issue of concern is the potential number of people within a space and what their expected familiarity with the building safety features are. We call this the occupant load and the occupancy type. The building code specifies an occupant load or anticipated number of people that might squeeze into a space for each type of occupancy. For example, desks, files, and walking space take up a lot of a room and offices, so their occupant load is 100 square feet per person, while a restaurant dining space can squeeze in more than 6 times that many, and so it's 15 square feet per person is the occupant load, or a gymnasium is only 6 square feet per person. The occupancy type determines additional safety measures that might be used for situations where people might need additional direction in an emergency. For example, the code anticipates that the residents of the apartment house at 138 College Street, that's the background plan, will be familiar with where the exits are in their building. But if you're staying in a hotel for only a night or two, you might not know, and that's why they have the published door sign that you see on the back of the doors, typically like the emergency exit plan on the upper left. Safety measures increase for all additional, occupancies, but the critical threshold typically is an occupancy of more than 50 people within a space elevates it to a next level. And the reason for this is that given even the group of PhDs, doesn't matter, people as a group get stupid and they panic. The fifth issue for fire safety is providing adequate exiting for each space and the building as a whole. The number of doors, their widths, the width of corridors, and the width of fire stairs are all determined by the occupant loads we've just discussed. Exit doors always need to swing in the direction of travel, in other words, the direction that you need to get out. Doors into small rooms with small occupancies can swing into the room, but otherwise they all have to swing out into the corridor and be pocketed back into an alcove so they don't swing into hitting people as they pass by. Exit doors also need to be indicated with illuminated exit signs, and sometimes even with secondary ones at floor level to be below any smoke. And finally, once a given occupancy level or type that requires it for controlling panic is involved, the doors have to be provided with panic bars. In other words, instead of a door handle, just a bar that you lean against to push and the door will open in the direction of travel. Now we can look at this image from Joyner Hall that we looked at a couple of weeks ago and see that the corridors have a tile finish, the exit doors are swinging into the fire stair with panic hardware, and they're called out with exit signs. While the first 5 approaches to fire safety design are essentially passive, or in other words, architectural, the last 2 we'll consider today are more active or more mechanical in nature in operations. The 6th tool that we use are warning systems, which can range in complexity from the simplest individual battery-powered smoke detector in your bedroom to a highly sophisticated digital system that's interconnected throughout the building and all its systems and to the fire department. The workhorse of warnings, though, is the basic fire alarm pull station that you see here on the left. If you are ever exiting a building in an emergency, please calm your panic for the moment to pull the alarm next to the exit to warn your fellow occupants. And the final tool in our arsenal is a fire suppression system. In a major sense, this is the panacea and get-out-of-jail card combined. As the public service announcement says, sprinklers save lives, and we continue to require them in more and more situations. One common misconception that TV and movies have promoted because of their need to create drama is that you can set off an entire building sprinkler system remotely or by holding a flame to a single sprinkler head. They don't work that way. If you focus on the image of the sprinkler head, you can see a red vertical element just above the rosette at the bottom trim. That is a glass vial fuse. This one is red because they come color-coded to different temperature settings that the designers will choose for different situations. When that vial reaches its design temperature, it will shatter and the head will open, but only that head, and it will suppress the fire where it's located. Other heads, adjacent or not, will only activate if they reach their safety temperature. Less dramatic and causing much less water damage as well. There are more aspects to fire safety, but a 7-item list is long enough for anybody, so we'll finish there. The background of this image, though, is a blow-up of the code sheet my firm prepared for the apartment house on College Street to remind me to make two last points about fire safety's design significance. The first is that the building code, which is administered by the building official, or the authority with jurisdiction, as we say, is used to play a game of economic trade-offs. We determine the size of the building project versus the cost of the required construction type for a given occupancy and size, and balance those two out so that it makes economic sense for our client. The second point is that in the U.S. we have two codes, actually, that we must meet concurrently. The building code and the separately administered and reviewed fire code, which is the purview of the fire marshal's office. The two codes overlap and are redundant in places, but they also conflict in some, so your design will have to satisfy the more stringent of the two in any given case. But the biggest difference between the two is that the fire code has requirements for existing structures, and those requirements are amended and upgraded as we learn more ways to combat fire and human frailty. What this means in actual practice is that once the building official and the architect sign off on a project and it receives its certificate of occupancy, its C of O, the building is done and will be grandfathered into 99% of any future issues. But on the other hand, ideally the fire marshal regularly visits and inspects all the buildings in his jurisdiction. Obviously they triage and set priorities based on building size, age, and uses, but they will generate a formal list of code deficiencies for existing buildings and give the property owner a time frame to correct them. So in that sense, it's a moving target always with the fire code. As we discussed in our second session, architects and building codes react to tragedies pretty quickly, usually, with code revisions and changing standards of practice. We'll finish out this section with a recognition of 4 fatal fires that sadly showed us where we were lacking up to that point. The granddaddy of tragedies is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 in Greenwich Village. Sadly, this one wasn't caused by the structure itself. The structure is still standing today and is actually being used by NYU. This was a case where practice and human frailty came into play. The exit ways had been locked, a bunch of them, and the ones that were open, people panicked and crushed themselves against because the doors weren't swinging in the proper direction. So this is one of the major causes of why fire marshals inspect buildings, make sure that the exits are operating correctly and that people can escape. Sadly, 146 people, mainly women and children, died to wake us up to, what we should have known already. The Coconut Grove nightclub fire of Boston in 1942 was a terrible tragedy. The building had been improperly adaptively reused from its original construction as a warehouse, and unfortunately had a trifecta of bad factors that multiplied to cause a loss of 492 lives. Firstly, the finishes and decorations installed to create a romantic setting were highly flammable. Secondly, the 3 levels weren't divided by fire-resistant construction, and in fact the open connecting stairs were so narrow that they acted as chimneys themselves. And finally, this happened on one of the first holiday weekends of World War II, and the building was overcrowded beyond the occupancy levels approved by the local fire marshals. In this case, the firefighters got the fire out within an hour, but it only took 5 minutes because of the chimney effect and the flammable finishes for it to engulf the entire building. It was terrible. The Station nightclub fire of Warwick, Rhode Island, almost 20 years ago, is another case where the building itself, construction, wasn't really the dominant aspect of the tragedy. It was human frailty, almost really stupidity. What happened was the band performing that night set off pyrotechnics inside this rather small space, which caught the flammable acoustic insulation in the back of the stage on fire. 100 people died in a rapidly smoke-filled space. This is an example where the code officials instantly reacted and changed the code so that any entertainment space, restaurant space, with 100 people or more occupancy has to be sprinkled. Well, we've already seen the Chrysler Building and the Ford Foundation building today. And in our second half, we're going to see another half dozen projects, all within a 10-minute walk of them. And so in celebration of that, we will have a musical interlude today of 42nd Street, the introductory tap dancing fantastic number. But it's really in celebration of this fantastic character, William Van Allen, the architect of the Chrysler Building, who won all bets and all stops when he came dressed as the Chrysler Building to the Beaux-Arts Ball in 1931. In this week's Architect Appreciation, we'll be looking at the spectacular skyscrapers of the wonderful Raymond Hood. While he didn't single-handedly transform the world's image of the skyscraper, remember this is a team sport, and Hood pretty much always worked with a revolving team of partners and joint venture architects. His vision has clearly influenced pretty much everyone else's work since, at least all the really good stuff, I think. In 1922, the Chicago Tribune sponsored a design competition for their new headquarters with a very rich prize allocation package. $50,000 for first, $20,000 for second, and even $10,000 for third. This was a lot of money then, and attracted substantial entries from around the world. Even the losing entries garnered a lot of attention. The four Germans on the left got worldwide press for their Bauhaus and fantasist concepts, while Eero Saarinen's father, Elio Saarinen, took second place and made the strongest impression on fellow practitioners, the one that you see in the center there. But Raymond Hood recognized that, as I said in our first week, the art of architecture is getting someone else to pay for your vision. He read the room correctly and designed a building that fit its context and the client's wishes and expectations, and they won. Hood was actually a native to our region. He was a New Englander, born and grew up in Pawtucket. He was an academic high achiever and went on to Brown studying math and drawing, but transferred midway to MIT for a more directed architectural degree, and then went on to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris as well. He worked in a number of offices throughout the East Coast when his classmate from the École, John Howells, invited him to join him in designing their competition entry. When they won and went on to successfully complete the project, it opened a box of opportunities for him. And as we'll see in the next 10 plus years, he designed increasingly sophisticated and beautiful skyscrapers, all for the most part within a 10-minute walk, as we've seen on the map in the intermezzo slide. The first opportunity to come his way was a new headquarters for the American Radiator Company. The building was built on 40th Street facing the open space of Bryant Park, and so had a beautiful forecourt to set off the tower. It's not nearly of the same scale as the Chicago Tribune project that he had. It's only 23 stories, an 18-story tower. But it is the first skyscraper to clearly tackle the sculptural and aesthetic possibilities of the new 1916 zoning law with setbacks and shaping down towers. My own favorite, the Empire State Building, is peeking over the building on the left, which is the headquarters of the Engineer Society, and you can clearly see how it learned from the lessons of the American Radiator Building. While Hood was known himself as an excellent draftsman in his academic years and early career, he collaborated in this case infrequently with the notoriously famous Hugh Ferris, who was an architect, but primarily, a delineator, most famous since Piranesi. Maybe we'll look at Piranesi's work later in the course. But the rendering on the right clearly indicates how this was an overall sculptural event. And nearly uniquely, Hood elected to use black brick. It is striking on this building, and then set it off with bronze powdered and gold leafed terracotta and cast stone decorative elements. My guess from particularly his later works is that Hood was also a refiner and an editor, as my predilection is. And in this case, the decorative elements were noted to have been designed by a collaborator that he frequently worked with. And he was able to have it incorporated successfully into the overall project. The American Radiator Company evolved into American Standard, which was the dominant supplier of plumbing fixtures also throughout the U.S. In my student and early career days, I used to visit this building frequently to pick up plumbing catalogs. That's not why I love the building, though. I just love the building. It is gorgeous. It's a hotel now, pretty zooty and, nicely adapted reuse of the building. The next project is the Daily News building on 42nd Street, right across the street from the Chrysler building. By 1930, Hood had passed right through Art Deco. This is certainly an Art Deco building, but it evokes, the 1960s with its dead flat top. There are no towers on this building. This is a cut-off slab. It looks like, the set for Mad Men. Of course, it most famously is the setting for Superman and the Daily Planet. This is the building he jumps and flies off of. And again, the Hugh Ferris rendering on the right clearly shows what a stripped down, gray flannel suit, beautiful study in just massing this project is. Following up hard on the heels of the Daily News, just a year later, he created the McGraw-Hill building on 42nd Street, almost over to 8th Avenue. This one tackles all sorts of new ground. It's just the polychromy, that incredible emerald green with the red pinstripes, and the recognition that a skyscraper is viewed on the skyline. The main facade facing 42nd Street is just, set in the context. Where the real play comes into is on the east and west facades, where you see it at a distance, and then there's a decorative interplay of the ribbon windows and the vertical bands, and the stepping and how it all pulls together as a massing. It's an incredible project. Unfortunately, Hood suffered from rheumatoid arthritis throughout most of his adult life, and it actually took his life. He died very young, at just age 53, and cut him off while he was the lead architect for the overall team of architects for Rockefeller Center. But in this case, arguably, I think he saved the best for last. the overall planning composition of the RCA building and its forecourt buildings, and the skating rink, of course, it's just incredible and spectacular. But the buildings themselves just set a high point that I don't know where it's ever been achieved again. This is one of my favorite places to be, not just the individual buildings, but to walk through and experience it as an architectural place. It is fabulous. Today in our Delights section, we'll be looking into two historic revivals popular in the U.S., the Romanesque and the Gothic revival. And we'll also take a little quick foray into one of my pet peeves, the idea of simplicity and having one good idea per building. The Romanesque revival was first popularized in Germany, where they called it the round-headed movement, reflecting that it was the Roman semicircular arches as opposed to the Gothic arches that they were using. In addition, it's always been associated with a dark palette, brown stone, red brick, and overall dark masonry tones. Probably the preeminent practitioner in the U.S. was H. Richardson of the Get the First Project fame that we mentioned in, I believe, in the first class. If not, we'll mention it again and again. This church, Trinity Church, the Episcopal Church in Boston's Logan Square, is spectacular. And it's historically noteworthy also because the young Stanford White, before he became a partner at McKinley & White, was one of the principal designers on this project as well. The idea that team sport didn't start, here it goes even further back, but it's noteworthy that it's such a small profession that everyone ends up, being connected at least, secondhand. Today, there are only still 120,000 architects in the U.S. altogether, and probably in the 1870s, there were, a few hundred. So we'll see as we go along in this little series how it gets incestuous, the internecine, connections of everyone. In any case, while this building is extremely exuberant and highly decorative, in a kind of additive way, it does really hang together with a single theme carrying it all the way through. Maybe the one exception is the little bit of Venetian herringbone that it interjected itself above the second course of little arches, but really it is a spectacular, simple, and elegant building. This next image is of the famous and lost Marshall Field Warehouse building. This image always inspired me in its robustness, and I love this look of what a Romanesque building could be like, with the heavy arches, the massive masonry, the straightforward expression of its massing. It's just a beautiful, beautiful building. So Richardson's office in New York designed this project in Chicago, and I never got to see it. It was demolished way before my time, but I always took it to have inspired a building on Lafayette Street, just down the street from Giorgio's Public Theater building. And here it is, the Devin Press building on Lafayette Street. Always been one of my favorite buildings. You see a sketch I did as a student there of the corner. And I took it to be very directly derivative of the Marshall Field Warehouse building, assuming just stylistically and looking at it. But then I've researched, reading books there are loads of books out about McKinley & White. And the extremely interesting thing is that this building, designed by Babcock and Willard, those three men, their offices were on the same building on the same floor as H. Richardson, and a floor below, I think, McKinley & White's offices in downtown New York. Well, staff would just work back and forth in the different offices, and it turns out that this building actually preceded the Marshall Field Warehouse building by a year, was done in the separate offices, but the one man, probably Joseph Wells, who was notoriously the most famous but undersung designer of the whole group, probably had his hand in all of them. He was a tremendous classicist, but I think that this may have been his. One detail I'd like you to note in the photograph of the building on the right is that currently the streetscape has been restored also, and it's got the classic Lamb's Hook streetlights in front of it. What's nice about that is that alongside his life as a typographer and publisher, Devin designed the original classic street lamps of New York City. And these probably are copies of his original design. Well, as we noted with the American Radiator building, it's nice to ascribe, kind of beginnings and movements in architecture to a given building. That's typically not really the case. Everything's been done before. But in this case, that's not true. The Gothic architecture actually does begin here. So the revival comes much later, of course, but this in 1140, Abbot Suger had the Saint Denis Basilica designed to house the tombs of the French nobility, kings and queens of France. So this is where Gothic architecture actually does start, this one building in Paris. Gothic revival movements follow two different trains, typically, the ecclesiastic and the academic. For the ecclesiastic example, I'm skipping out of the U.S. because the most wild but completely unified and single-purpose design of all time probably is the Gothic revival by Antoni Gaudí in Barcelona for the Sagrada Familia. This is a world lifetime experience worth the trip to fly there just to see this if you ever get the chance. Well, Gaudí died in the 20s, nearly a century before the building came to a pretty much completion. It follows his overall design pretty completely, and what a spectacular building it is. The structural design itself is amazing. He designed these by building catenary models, hanging strings from weights, and then photographing that, flipping the photograph upside down, and then tracing that to draw what these pinnacles and arches, how they work. In the U.S., Gothic revival, also had some residential elements as well, but the academic probably is the most used section of it, following on the models of wanting to trace lineage back to Oxford and Cambridge. James Gambrell Rogers was one of the dominant purveyors of this style. Yale has loads of his work, obviously. And again, these buildings they're additive and accretive, but they have a single vision, and they're gorgeous. And now finally close out with my pet peeve. Too many good ideas over on Gary's building on the left there, the so-called Fred and Ginger building of the dancing couple. The twist and the complexity is interesting, but a glass building and then a stucco building, and it's just, there's too much going on to be clear as to what he was trying to convey. I get it, but it's just too busy. The opposite, is to take a look at what I take to be probably his best building, I think. Absolutely gorgeous building on 11th Avenue near the Starrett Lehigh building that we looked at last week or the week before. A gorgeous building along the waterfront of the Hudson that evokes to me, a three-masted sailing ship. Just gorgeous glass building. Now we'll all join in and review each other's dramatic pieces on the works of Frank Lloyd Wright. And we can reflect on them, taking from the chapter 3, Contrasting Effects in Solids and Cavities, the concept, as he said, when as here architecture is interpreted as forms which swell, press, push out, etc., all motion phenomena. It's all really an attempt to show how the spectator recreates the building masses through the visual process. The observer is given a great deal to think about, though nothing that can tell him what the building itself contains. It's pure external drama, a play of architectural forms. For this week's assignment, please read Chapter 4, Architecture Experienced as Color Planes. And I'll make it a side note here for the moment to please remember the context of that this book was written in the 1940s and forgive Rasmussen's Eurocentric rhetoric. It's, take it in the context of its time. And note that he does recognize the value of other cultures and lifestyles in buildings. Then what I'd like you to do is please prepare a monograph on a work of your choosing of Mexican architect Luis Barragan. I've never gotten a chance to visit any of his, but just seeing photographs, it is spectacular and incredible, as this image in the background is. Please choose a number of buildings or a particular building to go in depth on, and a one-page illustrated monograph. And to conclude today, we'll wrap up with a case study of one of my favorite places in the world. I'm saying places, not buildings. Grand Central Terminal. This constrained image of the front facade of the building gives a hint as to what I'm talking about in terms of being one of the places. We're going to look at some of the history of the building and how it intertwines itself into the overall district. The fourth element of this photograph is one of the original railway tunnels that continued on down to 23rd Street that's been now adapted to handle a couple of lanes of traffic instead. And then once it hits 39th Street, then it rises up in a viaduct over, passes around the terminal building itself, so that auto traffic starts below the grade, comes up above grade, wraps around the building, and comes out again onto Park Avenue. The road traffic itself is worth taking a taxi ride to go around and through it. As I mentioned in the last slide, the fabulous complexity of the multimodal hub of Grand Central is a direct expression of its unique history. Originally, the railroad came into Manhattan from the continental U.S. over bridges from the Bronx, as it still does, and as seen in this map from the 1840s, extended all the way down to a terminal at 23rd Street. These steam-powered lines, however, became too noxious for the city center, and so the lines were shortened to 42nd Street, and the tunnels of Park Avenue South, as we've seen, were not filled in but left for roadway traffic. In 1871, this precursor to the terminal, the Grand Central Depot, was built on our site with a glorious open steel and glass train shed, similar to European terminals, opening onto a very extensive open-air train yard to the north. In other words, north of the depot was kind of like a kind of dystopian industrial wasteland. It was not a beautiful residential area or any other use. It was just open train yards. So this is the physical setting for what was transformed in 1913, as we'll see. And now we come to the crux of the story. How Grand Central came to be not only the most beautiful way to enter New York City, but also the focal point for a whole new midtown. And the hero is not any of the architects involved, but the brilliant geographic genius William Wilgus, the railroad's chief engineer. I learned his story in this really captivating little book, Grand Central, How a Train Station Transformed America by Sam Roberts. In 1902, there was a terrible fatal train collision in the tunnels north of the depot, caused by the train crews being blinded by the steam engine smoke. Public and political reactions were fierce, some even proposing eliminating rail service in Manhattan altogether and building a new terminal in the Bronx. Electrification of the lines would prevent future accidents, but the rail service itself didn't seem capable of financing the construction, and particularly the expense of new rolling stock. But Mr. Wilgus had a vision for an integrated solution that not only solved the safety issues, it funded the construction of the new jewel in the crown of New York City's public spaces, doubled the capacity of the terminal, and created the impetus for the development of some of the most valuable real estate in the world. He doggedly fought for the following concepts that were ultimately built in 1913 as follows. By electrifying the trains, all railroad traffic could be subterranean, and consequently could even be on more than one level below grade, so there was no longer any need for a train shed all the platforms for people boarding trains could be directly below or within the station itself. And the way they laid it out originally was long-distance trains came in on the main concourse level, and commuter trains came in on the lower level. He is also the one who came up with the concept of routing the traffic from the road traffic up and around and through the new complex so that traffic along Park Avenue wasn't interrupted by the building any longer. And finally, and most consequently, he came up with the idea of building a deck over the railroad yards and where the train shed had stood altogether, so that 26 square blocks of new real estate was created that could be long-term leased or sold off to fund all of the other construction. He hadn't created the idea of air rights, but no one had ever attempted this, and he was so highly successful with it. Not only is the terminal one of the most beautiful places in the world, but he created Park Avenue as a premier office and hotel space, and ultimately developed into the residential high-end space of America as well. The plan that you're seeing below shows the upper level of tracks that when you're on the grade level outside in 42nd Street and Park Avenue and Lexington Avenue, you're completely aware of what's going on beneath you. And of course, in addition, there are subway lines connecting to it, taxi stands, bus services outside. This is the multimodal hub of New York City, certainly on the east side. While this isn't an exact image of the same location before, essentially he turned what looked like this into this, and this can't be beat. This is, of course, an image from, it looks like the 40s probably, but of course maybe the 50s, before the Pan Am building was built and kind of ruined the vista down Park Avenue, but still beautiful. It created the opportunity ultimately for this. This is Lever House by Gordon Bunshaft. If you remember, my mentor Giorgio's captain in the Army was a very famous architect as well. This is a beautiful high point of the international style Lever House. You can see the clear influence of Raymond Hood and the Daily News building flat top slab construction here, I think. This is the beautiful plaza that goes under the one wing of the building and is open to the public on Park Avenue. Just absolutely gorgeous space. Renovated about 10 years ago, is pristine again. This is an image of the Oyster Bar in the terminal. Great restaurant, wonderful place. I hope you go and enjoy an oyster stew or a plate of sardines. And this is an image from the 1920s. And here it is relatively today. It's still, and you can see how gorgeous it is. This is Guastavino tile vaulting that forms the structure and the finishes of the space. And since 1913, the clock has been the place to meet in Midtown. And as they say, you get to enter New York City like royalty when you come into the main concourse waiting room. What I love about this space, this place, is that it is still it's so public. The sky is painted in the vault above you. You still are in completely public space once you've entered and come through into here. It's just glorious. This is the high point of our civilization for me. And with that, I'll sign off and see you next week.